Hello, my name is Alan Tidwell. I'm the director of the Center for Australian and New Zealand Studies at Georgetown University, and I'm pleased to present to you today Blue Pacific Futures, featuring Dame Meg Taylor, Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum. I'm pleased to introduce this event today. This is a wonderful new partnership between the Center for Australian, New Zealand and Pacific Studies at Georgetown and the Center for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And this is an occasional talk, and we're so pleased that kicking off this talk is Dame Meg Taylor. And let me introduce Meg to you, and she'll speak for a little while, and then we'll have two discussants. Professor Tara Kabadalaka of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and Jerry Finnen, an associate at the Center for Australian, New Zealand and Pacific Studies at Georgetown as discussants. Let me introduce to you Dame Meg Taylor. Dame Meg is a native of Papua New Guinea, and she is the Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum, a role she started in 2014. She's the first woman to take that role and to lead the Pacific Island Forum into this what will be hopefully a post-COVID world. Before taking on this role, Dame Meg was the ombudsman for the International Finance Corporation and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency of the World Bank. Prior to that, Dame Meg was ambassador to the United States, Canada, and Mexico from 1989 to 1994. She holds her LLM from Harvard University and an LLB from the University of Melbourne. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dame Meg Taylor and ask Meg to speak to us about Blue Pacific Futures. What does the future hold for the Pacific? Dame Meg.
Thank you very much, Alan. And good morning from the Forum Secretariat in Suva, Fiji, to all of you around the world. I'm very pleased to join you all this morning at this inaugural webinar series on Blue Pacific Futures. To begin my reflections, allow me to introduce very briefly the Pacific Island Forum and Pacific regionalism. The Pacific Island Forum grouping comprises 18 members made up of independent, self-governing states, as well as 2 territories. Indeed, this is the pinnacle of a much broader regional architecture that underpins, operationalizes, and progresses regionalism in the Pacific region. The Pacific Islands Forum is representation of our collective effort as one Pacific region to advocate our priorities and progress our regional positions within the broader global context. The Pacific Islands Forum was formally established in 1971 and reaches its 50th anniversary in August next year. In all respects, the Pacific Islands Forum was the very demonstration of Pacific regionalism up until recently. To appreciate this grouping and how it has evolved today, one has to understand the history and context within which it was established. One could say that the forum was birthed out of political frustration, a frustration of the independent Pacific Island states who wish to have greater autonomy and authority in discussing political matters that concern them collectively, including regional development. Indeed, Ratu Sukumasesemara, a founding father of the Pacific Islands Forum, eloquently recounts the rationale for the establishment of the forum in his memoir, The Pacific Way. So I urge you to try and read that book. To put it simply, Pacific Island nations were racing towards independence, and with this newfound power and independent identity, Pacific Island nations wanted to have a greater say in their development trajectories and the related political discussions required. Riding on the coattails of this newfound regional identity was the success of regionally coordinated pursuits on matters that were important to the region. The establishment of the nuclear-free zone in the Pacific through the Rarotonga Nuclear-Free Treaty in 1985, and the successful conclusion of the negotiations on the law of the sea, to name a few. It is in its near 5-decade history, the Pacific Islands Forum has continued to shape and guide Pacific regionalism, including its efforts at regional integration. This journey has not been easy, and indeed it has registered successes as well as failures. And still we continue to work together to identify issues whereby our collective voices will ensure its successful progression. We continue to demonstrate collective efforts in areas that are pertinent to our development as a region, including in the areas of trade, sustainable economic development, social inclusion, governance, human rights, self-determination, and security. On sectoral issues, the key focus really is on our fisheries. From a global perspective, it is easy to question the relevance and ongoing value of a collective grouping such as the Pacific Islands Forum, given its size and characteristics. It is always easy to overlook the significance of the forum when compared to the might of other regional groupings such as the European Union, the African Union, ASEAN, and the Caribbean Community, to name a few. However, to do so, I would suggest, would be a grave mistake. The Pacific region is nestled between some of the world's largest economic powers. Together, Pacific nations are custodians of the largest and richest ocean resource in the world, the Pacific Ocean, which is the Pacific Ocean. And indeed, it is on this very resource that the Pacific Islands Forum has galvanized and reinvigorated its collective solidarity since 2017 under the Blue Pacific identity. At the multilateral level, the votes of the Forum Island countries, and together with other small island developing states, are a formidable grouping whose votes are sought after, particularly for the UN Security Council seats. But historically, the Forum has demonstrated its importance as a strategic asset amidst the geopolitics and tensions at the global level. Indeed, some would offer that the 1987 multilateral treaty on fisheries between Pacific Island countries and the United States was concluded as a result of increasing Russian interest in the region during the Cold War. Perhaps an indication of how the region would drive competing external interests in the region in years to come. With that context in mind, allow me to turn to the present and Pacific regionalism as we know it today. I assumed the role of the Secretary General to the Pacific Island Forum in the latter end of 2014, the first woman to hold this position in the history of the Forum. As a Secretary General to the Pacific Island Forum, I head the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, the institution tasked with delivering on regionalism in the Pacific region. I came into this position at the end of the Sumakara Murata-led 2013 review of the Pacific Plan, a robust and comprehensive regional review of the effectiveness of the Pacific Plan. Amongst other matters, the review considered the governance and priority setting of Pacific regionalism and to what extent the regional institutional architecture supported the strategic directions of the Pacific Plan. What the 2013 review had found was the Pacific regionalism had, I quote, lost its politics, and that the entire regional agenda was now driven by technocrats, and that citizens' voices about the kind of Pacific that is emerging are not heard in the absence of coherent, effective regional governance, end of quote, by Murata. So therefore, my work was clear, and I had to firstly reignite the politics in regionalism through a prioritized and impactful regional agenda, and secondly, institute a process that would ensure that the voice of the Pacific people was heard and heeded. So what ensued from these two tasks were a range of activities which, taken together, were to affect what was recommended through the 2013 review of the Pacific. We instituted a gradual yet systematic change to forum structure, though in no particular order. Firstly, the implementation of the framework of Pacific regionalism, which included the institutionalization of inclusivity in the forum structures and processes. To achieve this, formal spaces were established on the margins of standing forum meetings for our civil society and private sector to have a voice and feed into the discussion of the forum members at both the ministerial and at the leaders' retreat. during the Pacific Island Forum meetings itself. Secondly, strengthening political relationships between and on behalf of the Pacific Island Forum and the collective identity that is the Blue Pacific identity. Testament to this is also the settlement of key political declarations in regional security and climate change. Firstly, the Boy Declaration of 2018, the Security Declaration, the Kanakailua Declaration for Urgent Climate Action now in 2019, and just recently the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway on COVID-19. Thirdly, the reform and refocus of the Forum Secretariat and its operations to ensure that it was fit for purpose and would deliver a prioritized regionalism agenda for the Pacific. And fourthly, the implementation of the sustainable funding strategy, which was designed to ensure that the Secretariat delivers independent and robust regional policy advice to the Forum with adequate and predictable funding from its membership. A key tenet of this strategy, and this is really important, was ownership and the rebalancing of the assessed membership contribution of the Pacific Island Forum to 51-49 and a 49 ratio, whereby the Forum Island members would contribute 51% and Australia and New Zealand contribute 49% of total assessed membership contributions. Whilst we worked on these key initiatives within and amongst ourselves as the Pacific Island Forum, around us, we were beset with unparalleled geostrategic interests which were beginning to permeate throughout the region and in the bilateral and regional relationships that were being pursued in and by the Pacific region. But let me turn to the securing of the Blue Pacific continent first. In 2017, Samoa assumed the role of chair of the Pacific Island Forum, and with that, it set a new impetus for collective action in the Pacific through the Blue Pacific identity. The Blue Pacific sought to recapture the collective potential of our shared stewardship of the Pacific Ocean, based on an explicit recognition of our shared ocean identity, ocean geography, and ocean resources. It strengthens collective action as one Blue Pacific continent. By putting the Blue Pacific at the center of the policy making and collective action for advancing the Pacific Island Forum leaders' vision for our region. Indeed, to strengthen our claim to the Blue Pacific identity, we must ensure that we are able to secure the Blue Pacific continent for us and for our future generations. In effect, we must formalize our boundaries as provided for under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. To date, 13 of the 48 shared boundaries remain to be concluded and 5 high sea limits remain to be declared. Work has also begun on the region, in the region to ensure that members' maritime zones are set into perpetuity and once delineated cannot be challenged or reduced, particularly as a result of sea level rise and climate change. I am of the firm belief that our identity secures our collective home, the Blue Pacific continent, which is designated by our exclusive economic zones that cover over 40 million square kilometres. With these foundations in place, the region now works towards the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. As mandated by leaders in 2019, this strategy comes at an opportune time and will inform the region's trajectory over the next 3 decades. At its core, the 2050 strategy is about securing the future and development aspirations of our Blue Pacific and recognises that this will require strong regional collective action and aligned support from our international partners. The challenges to regionalism that I've observed coming into the role of Secretary General has since been severely altered as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, I will offer a few thoughts on the matter. Perhaps the most prominent challenge I was immediately faced with as Secretary General was the relevance of the Pacific Island Forum and by relation, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. Indeed, some have commented that the suspension of Fiji as a member of the Forum in 2009 had resulted in the increased prominence of sub-regional groupings in the Pacific, including the Melanesian Spearhead Group and the Pacific Small Island Developing States grouping. A consequence of this was the perceived demise in the relevance of the Pacific Island Forum. Whilst it reinforced the urgency with which to implement my two key taskings, as set out under 2013 review, I grew to appreciate the role of sub-regional groupings and their purposes. We could not have achieved our collective positions in climate negotiations without them. With regard to geopolitics, we continue to navigate with the increasing external interest in the Pacific region, coupled with increasing preferences for bilateral engagements and relations to support national priorities and positions. These serve to further divert interest in a collective forum-wide approach to development-oriented partnerships with our forum dialogue partners. Whilst bilateralism is important, the collective can be the powerhouse of external engagement and diplomacy. In recent years, we've begun to see global politics play out in the regional context. The increasing yet quiet presence of China in the Pacific has triggered a range of Pacific-focused strategies and aid programs in our region. These sentiments are not a secret, and indeed Pacific leaders have commented on the ongoing tussle quite publicly. At the end of the day, Pacific leaders will manage these competing interests and leverage opportunities that will benefit their nations. At a regional security level, we recognize the need to strengthen regional security efforts given the changing political geostrategic trends in the region. This resulted in the 2018 Boy Declaration, which built on the Bikatawa Declaration and further expanded the definition of regional security beyond its traditional definition to now include matters such as human and climate security. However, moving forward, the regional security landscape, as with other key sectors, will continue to be shaped now and into the immediate future by COVID-19. Climate change is the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. It is by far the largest and most influential trigger of regionalism and collective action in recent years and has triggered strong advocacy efforts the world over and has catapulted the Pacific region to the forefront of international politics and advocacy. Perhaps one of the most memorable events of strong, coherent, and coordinated Pacific advocacy would be the region's efforts at COP21 in Paris, France in 2015. However, to be frank, climate action also continues to be the most challenging of regional initiatives. Admittedly, whilst it should be the one issue that everyone is committed to, the balancing of contrasting views on climate action and advocacy continues to be a challenge. As a consequence, we continue to see how members utilize various forms of regional groupings to progress and advocate priorities at the global level. However, moving forward to 2019, back to 2019, we have seen the political settlement of what has become the strongest political declaration on climate change by the Pacific Island Forum, and that is the Kanakailua Declaration on Urgent Climate Action Now. So I offer these views as mere observations from my tenure as Secretary General. And in conclusion, I just want to say that regionalism is not an easy task. To balance the differing views and positions of 18 members who are quite different in political, economic, and social characteristics is an onerous task. Regionalism is a long game. The fruits of your labor are not immediate, but they will eventuate if we continue to remain committed to it and its ideals. And at the end of the day, we must remain true to our commitment to our people, our countries, and our region. If we serve in their interest, then we come out better for it at the end. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, regionalism can only work if we have strong leaders who remain committed to this ideal. Leadership is absolutely crucial to the prosecution of regionalism in the Pacific region. History has indeed confirmed this. The strength of the collective is very much dependent on the appetite of the political leadership to continue to commit to regionalism. So I thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you so much, Dame Meg. That was an inspiring and thoughtful presentation. I'd like to now turn to our two discussants. And we'll start off with Tarcisius Kabudalaka, the director of the Center for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii. And just, Tara, before I throw to you, just a quick comment, if I could. I'd like to encourage our audience members to use the Q&A function to lodge questions. So please, anytime that a question comes to you, by all means, do lodge a question in the Q&A function. Tara, over to you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Tomas, Meg, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'll be really, really brief. A couple of things that I want to mention just to highlight some of the things that Dame Meg Taylor mentioned. And the first one is, the Blue Pacific as a mechanism for enhancing regionalism and collective efforts in collective diplomacy, something that we've seen work in the past. And for things like what Meg mentioned in relation to the anti-nuclear movement, the Rarotonga Treaty, the collective efforts on fisheries, and so forth. And so it has proven that collective diplomacy does work for Pacific Island countries. And we've seen it work in the past, and therefore looking forward to see how we can utilize it, particularly for issues such as climate change, which is Pacific-wide. A couple of things to talk about, though, is that, as I see it, the Blue Pacific is not only an attempt to enhance regionalism, but also an attempt to assert Pacific Island interest in a rapidly changing global order, and saying to people out there that, yes, some of the issues that you have raised are important, but for Pacific Island countries, for instance, at the center of a lot of the interest for Pacific countries is issues such as climate change. And so it is a mechanism for an assertion of Pacific Island interest in this changing global order. And in these, the two major powers, and perhaps Dame Meg Taylor can talk about this later, is that the two major powers that have influenced this space that we call the Pacific are the US and increasingly China. The US and its allies, and particularly the US Indo-Pacific strategy, and how that influences not only relationships with Pacific Island countries, but also relationships between Pacific Island countries. And therefore, the politics within members of the Pacific Island Forum. And on the other hand, we have China's growing interest, especially associated with the Maritime Silk Road. And in these relationships, one thing that Meg mentioned is the fact that these countries, China and the US, and to a certain extent, Australia and New Zealand, have bilateral relationships. But at the same time, they have this multilateral commitment as post-forum dialogue partners. And so perhaps, sometimes the disconnect, or maybe the tensions between bilateral relationships and multilateral relationship, is something that perhaps worth looking at. And in this discussion as well, it sometimes brings to mind the kinds of tensions or the kinds of politics that existed during the Cold War period. And how is this playing out in the region? Is this what we are seeing, a reoccurrence of the Cold War era kind of politics between superpowers, and Pacific Island countries are caught in between and trying to negotiate how they fit into this? The second point I want to raise is the membership of the Pacific Island Forum, and that has changed over time. And I'm wondering whether the changing membership, particularly the inclusion of places like French Polynesia, raises tensions within the forum, and whether it's French Polynesia that has become a member of the forum, or is it France? And so discussions about changing membership and whether or not that gives space for others, like take, for instance, places like Guam or American Samoa or other Pacific territories, US territories, to then want to become member of the Pacific Islands Forum. The final thing I wanted to mention, or two more things. The first one is COVID-19. And I was wondering, so there are both bilateral or national responses to COVID-19, and there are also multilateral responses. And I know that the Pacific Island Forum has put in place the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway as a response to COVID-19. Now, outside of the leaders' discussions, amongst a lot of Pacific Islanders, COVID-19 has provided an opportunity for us to not only examine how we respond to it, but also look at alternative ways or pathways to development. That these gives us the opportunity to look at, are there other ways of doing things that are different from what we had prior to COVID-19? So I'm wondering whether that discussion is only taking place amongst NGOs and church organizations, or is it beginning to filter in with discussions amongst Pacific Island leaders? My final comment is other regional organizations. As we know, the Pacific Island Forum is not the only regional organization. There are others, and there are lots of them out there, both intergovernmental as well as non-government organizations. And I'm wondering how they fit into the Blue Pacific and moving forward. So those are my comments for now. And thank you again, Meg, for sharing your time and wisdom and experience on this issue.
Okay, Meg, I'll leave this to you. Would you like to respond to Tara's comments, or should we go to Jerry and take the two discussants together? What's your preference?
Tara.
I'm sorry?
If I may. I'll respond to Tara, if I may.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
Yeah. So let me, first of all, just go to the geopolitics. The way, as Secretary General, the way I see it, Tara, but on the geopolitics, China has a very strong relationship with many of our countries, and our countries have also signed up to the Belt and Road or the Belt and Seaways. Those relationships, around the economic issues, but there's strong political relationship. You see other countries that have a relationship with stronger relationship with the United States than others. The focus of the US very much being in the North and not in the Southern Pacific. There's been an absence, although there's been greater activity over the last year with COVID-19. You see the interest of the United States. You also see the progress of the Indo-Pacific strategy and the partners to that, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, United States, are very much more active within the region. How does the Pacific and how do the leadership handle that? Well, I think Pacific leaders know the art of diplomacy, and they really use this to their advantage, so that it's what the benefits for our countries are in terms of the relations they have with these two big powers, but also with other powers that are in the region. We have an agreement called the 1992 arrangement of the countries that recognize China and Taiwan. And in all our meetings, and we also remind both of those countries that everybody is treated equally and accorded the respect because member states have recognized different countries. So that's the way it's done through the forum. We've had our ups and downs at some points, but we've tried to keep this maintained. Just over the last year, particularly though, you notice China's role much more subdued, strong relations with its bilateral partners, and it supports us in our trade work in China. And then of course, you've got the US now trying to make a re-entry back into the Southern Pacific. With regards to the membership of the forum, the decision to allow the two French territories, New Caledonia and French Polynesia, was very much, it was the decision of the leaders. And the implications of the membership of the forum, I think also bears on what you raise as your fourth point on regional architecture, because you have metropolitan powers that also sit on as members of some of our crop agencies. These are the regional organisations. And I sit as chair of the crop agencies, and I am very frank about this now that as I'm leaving. It is hard work, because the decisions of the Pacific Island Forum should be the paramount decisions for this region. But you've got other institutions that have members like the United States, the UK and France as members, and then the influence that they can have in those other agencies is also important. So the part of the 2050 strategy, there is a component of that will be a review of regional architecture. And I think that review should be very, very robust, so that you get some alignment in this region as to what the leaders of the Pacific want and what we should be doing. I'm not dismissing regional dialogue partners. I'm not dismissing the partnerships that we have with the European Union and other countries, but it's about the region taking control of its own destiny, and that for the future. You mentioned the issue around COVID-19 and the work that we've done in the development of these 8 protocols, which have been very important for the movement of people, but particularly the movement of health supplies into our member states. I think what we've found is one of the key issues that has emerged for us is that there is a real weakness in our health system. So we have to strengthen that to be able to look after our own people. There is also countries that invested very heavily in tourism have suffered a lot because of the jobs that people had, so economic recovery. And in that deliberation, of course, people are talking about, well, what kind of economic recovery? And does it have to be what it used to be? Is there we should be diversifying, what should we be diversifying into to sustain ourselves first? And then if we're going to trade, how we trade. And we're looking at, from where we sit at the Secretariat, looking at e-commerce, et cetera, so that people have an opportunity trade. I think the broader debate on the future and how we manage all this, and the philosophy, I guess, that will emerge from the Blue Pacific will be, and the future, the leaders have asked for a meeting on this in their retreat in December. And hopefully through that, we'll get some direction from the top. The foreign ministers have deliberated on it, but they're really looking at how we're going to manage this going forward in terms of recovery and what assistance that's needed to get in to make sure that our people are secure. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Meg. Let's now turn to Jerry Finnen, an associate of the Center for Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies at Georgetown, and also an adjunct faculty member at Cornell University. Jerry, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you, Dame Meg, for that very thought-provoking and wide-ranging reflection. My questions largely complement those of Tara's, perhaps with a little more specificity. You've mentioned the U.S. and the Cold War, and as you know, Hawaii Congressman Ed Case, along with colleagues, has been instrumental in forming a bipartisan Pacific Islands caucus. In July of this year, he also introduced something known as the Blue Pacific Act, which lays out a new vision for U.S. foreign policy in the Pacific Islands region and proposes $1 billion per year to Pacific Island nations over the next 5 years. Without wanting to be cynical about it, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, to what extent might this be a transactional replay of Cold War efforts to repulse Soviet influence in the Pacific Islands, or alternatively, perhaps a long-term framework for sustained US engagement and partnership with its neighbors in the region. Certainly that's been getting a lot of attention of late around Washington, and so I would just really value your perspective on that. The second thought that came to mind as I was listening to your reflections has to do with the way in which the North Pacific and South Pacific sort of fit together as one region. In light of the strong linkages that exist among the three Pacific Island nations in free association with the US, as well as the solidarity recently articulated by Kiribati and Nauru with respect to the selection of the next PIF Secretary General, I'm just wondering in a more general way, how do you foresee things going vis-a-vis the North and South Pacific? Do you foresee a difficult path ahead for regionalism that includes both parts of the region? Are there cultural differences that make that more of a challenge than it might otherwise be? And then just in conclusion, I was wondering if you would be kind enough to offer some thoughts as your 6-year tenure as Pacific Island Forum Secretary General concludes. What are some of the accomplishments that you take greatest pride in? What are some of the things that you feel most optimistic about going forward?
Thank you very much, Jerry. Let me look at. Yes, let me go to this Blue Pacific Act. I think some of my colleagues may have had a read of it. I've not really paid a lot of attention to it. I have to be really honest, only because if I was going to be passing legislation in a parliament that or a Congress that takes the name of the Pacific, it would be nice to have some discussions about the future and the relationships. But obviously the congressman doesn't see that as necessary. Is it a transaction replay? It could be. But the question here would be, if you're going to put $1 billion, how best is it used? And what part of the Pacific is it going to be focused on? And if you look at if I was asked a question, where would I put the emphasis on? It'd be on education and making sure that you had scholarships available to students to come to Hawaii, but then to go beyond Hawaii onto the mainland into some of the top schools there, and make sure that you have that in for a decade to 2 decades to 3 decades, so that you build up a cadre of people that have a really an understanding of the United States, have a relationship with people there in the United States, and have learned from institutions in the United States. It just makes a big difference in people's lives. So I look at the thousands of students or hundreds of students that go from the Pacific and then from all the countries themselves through a bilateral relationship to China. And I can drive through Beijing, and I kid you not, and come to a traffic light and all these Papua New Guineans shouting out my name because we just have students in many parts of that city. What we'd like to see is an investment in the future generations. I think that $1 billion is a lot of money, but it's how it's going to be spent. And is it going to be spent to ensure that the US's position is secured? And then the question is, how best do you secure that? And is it through the relationship with people, or is it through relationships with institutions, or is it about the broader militarization of the Pacific? I'd like to see a sustained partnership, and I think the only way that can happen is through investment in people. You asked the question about the differences in the Pacific. Well, there's Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. And I think it's at the very heart of it is what I've been trying to emphasize is that, yes, you have sub-regional groupings, etc. Can you just move that? It's distracting me. Sorry. But at the heart of it is that recognizing that there are differences, but that's the most important part of us. We have different music, we have different languages. My country itself has a third of the world's languages. But what we do is we bring it together as a through regional solidarity. I would really be very saddened if there was a split between the North and the South. We've brought our countries together. There are different political alliances with the United States, but then you've got the French territories, and as Tara has asked about, the French influence, or the French being at the table when you have French Polynesia and New Caledonia at the table. And you have those influences. The job of the Secretary General is to help the leaders to navigate that, particularly those political relationships. I think the cultural differences they do enrich us, because when we visit and go to each other's countries for the forum meetings, it's sharing of those differences. But what is it that holds the Pacific together? And this is at the very heart of what the Blue Pacific is about how we value our customs, value our families, value our community. And those decisions and the processes we make decisions for all of us are so very, very important. Now, the third one you gave me, I've just asked my Nicola to look at, so the accomplishments that we've done over my tenure. I think the one that I value has been inclusivity. I'm a great proponent of that. We have 13 million people in this region. The voice of people, the voice of young people, women, but making sure that the future generation is secured and that what they have to say is important is really what I have tried to make sure is implemented. And I had that was what the outcome of the review, the 2013 review was, and we've come a long way. I don't think there's anywhere else in the world where the representatives of the private sector, but the CSOs actually meet with the forum leaders on the days of their meeting. What I would be most concerned about, I'm just going back to that. The second thing that I'm really, I take away that I am pleased with is that I think we've brought politics back into the discussions and politics back into the region. And it was very evident in the negotiations of the Kanakailua Declaration on Climate. And I know many people were uncomfortable with that, but politics is uncomfortable. But that's what political leadership is about, is to have those tough discussions and then find the way forward. And that's, we've been able to do that, and nobody got seriously burnt by that process. If anything, it showed that Pacific leadership can have very different views, and they will come to a conclusion at the end that is satisfactory to them. Fragmentation of the region, as I've said earlier in that question you asked about Micronesia, I think that would be something that I'd be very disappointed with. And I hope that through the process that we put in place now for the leaders to select the next Secretary General, that we will get a candidate that will serve the region ably, and that everyone in the region will get behind that Secretary General so he or she can do her job. It's been an incredible honor to serve here. It's had its ups and downs, I can certainly say that. It's had its times, but I hope I go back to my own country a much richer person for being here. Thank you.
Meg, thank you so much. And Jerry, thank you so much for your questions. Meg, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'd like to offer to you if I could. The first comes from Gregory Brown. Greg is wondering if you could say more about the Pacific Island countries and more broadly, the application of the UN Convention of Law of the Sea if EEZs are frozen. Greg asks, does the proposal only address the potential loss of jurisdiction due to rising sea levels, or does it also propose to curb increasing jurisdiction for states with expanding territory? what ideas for how many countries' EEZs may be preserved if all the land becomes submerged? And that's a very confronting question. The second comes from April Herlevy. I'll give you these two, Meg, if that's okay, and we can tackle them together. And April asks, she finds your discussion of the Pacific Islands for a focus on inclusivity to be quite inspiring. What can regional institutions elsewhere in the world learn from the Pacific Island forums in this area of inclusivity? So let me leave those with you if I could, Dame Meg.
Very much, and thank you to the two questions. First of all, the one on the sea level rise. We had a really extraordinary conference here, which you can go online, I think, on our website and see some of the discussions or the results from that on maritime boundaries. The key issue here for us is that whether we will lose territory with the sea level rise, and the purpose is to secure our EEZs now and ensure that they stay like that in perpetuity. The work that we are doing is in early stages. Some of our missions in New York have expertise there that are further ahead on this than the rest of us. But what we are doing is working very closely with the International Law Commission to make sure that whatever suggestions we put forward on this, that we can get them, we can get some traction on it. There is a lot of discussion within the region about the creation of customary international law, that as we delineate our boundaries and then we pass legislation in our own parliaments, that we can then deposit this at the United Nations, and that will be part of the process in terms of securing our boundaries for the future. If we can secure all our boundaries and it's recognized, and then say in time we do lose our islands, I should hope that legally we will always have claim over those territories, even if they are under the sea. And that is about access to resources, fisheries and deep sea mining, or whatever countries want to do with their boundaries. But it's also about people psychologically. It's about who they are as people, that they once lived there. But that's not a discussion at the moment. The key discussions at the moment is really to make sure that we work with the International Law Commission to see how we can pursue this discussion. And I'm sure I'm not the expert on it, but my Deputy Secretary General is very much the expert on it, and he's chairing the work going forward on this with experts to put this take this work back to the leaders for the meeting next year. Thank you. The issue of inclusivity, I think that it should be. I know that at the Commonwealth Secretariat, anyway, they have a whole organisation that works with civil society, and that's the Commonwealth Foundation. I think at the UN you have meetings that civil society have, and senior people, the Secretary General comes to those meetings. But for us here, yes, we are smaller, and I think it's really important that you hear that we have the voices of the people of the Pacific to be part of this. Because traditionally we come from of customs where leaders speak and nobody else says a word, and in particular women. And what I'm trying to encourage within my own the Secretariat I head is to help our women who work here, particularly our young, smart staff, is to be not afraid to voice an opinion and contribute to the discussion that is about the development of our region. But thank you for your interest in that, and if there's anything I can do to help where you are, let me know.
Thank you, Dame Meg. We've got two more questions. Emil Freiberg from the Government Accountability Office is asking if you could give a follow-up on the concerns around sea level rise. What are the regional plans and approaches to arrange for migration rights if that were to become necessary? And a second question, I have to admit, is from me. And I'm curious, Dame Meg, as your expertise as a problem solver, as a negotiator, as a peacemaker, I was wondering if I could ask you to reflect for a minute or two on whether you have concerns for peace and stability amongst the Pacific Island countries, particularly in the face of growing tensions between the United States and its allies and the People's Republic of China. Is there space for greater understanding of conflict resolution methodologies? Is there an opportunity for the Pacific Islands Forum or others amongst the Pacific Islands to promote and support conflict resolution perspectives and address some of those the issues there? And I'll leave it there. And we've got another question coming up in just a moment. But Dame Meg, over to you for the time being.
Let me turn to the second question first, and that's around peace and stability. Well, you know, what would help before you get to a conflict resolution stage is to have a conversation about what the superpowers want to do in the region. The issue of the Indo-Pacific strategy, very few people in the region actually really know what it's all about, and particularly our leaders. I think over the last year, much more heightened awareness of it, but there was a time when it was being really pushed hard by one of the northern members of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and nobody had had the courtesy to have a discussion with Pacific leaders. And I think this is what I find really quite extraordinary in this region, is that somebody will ask a question of us, and if we say, well, and when we want to express an opinion, they say, oh, it's okay, we've already discussed it with Australia about what's happening in the region. Well, as much as Australia is a member of the forum, it doesn't speak for all the members of the forum. And I think that I hope that the United States will take that on board and have conversations directly with the member states and not through our bigger states, that we have good relations that are a member of the forum, participate willingly, and I think try to give advice to others. But I think member states of the forum, the Pacific Island countries, need to be heard and to be part of conversation so that there is no conflict. The Chinese have a very, from what my observation, just a very different strategy. It's not as rambunctious. It's not pushing a certain agenda that we're all sitting here watching. In the last year, if anything, I've noticed it's much quieter and very focused on what's going to be the development agenda in this region. But the final decision in any country will be the parliaments of those countries, and hopefully we won't have that conflict. I don't think that, I think that if there is a need for conflict resolution, and we had a conflict resolution officer here, but they're more in terms of what was happening in countries, I think that there's always room for that. But I think sharing information, sharing your purpose, what you want to do in this region, and making sure that the sovereignty of the Pacific is acknowledged and recognized would be a really good way to start to begin with. On the sea level issue that was raised, as a result of the Foreign Ministers meeting just recently, we have now set up a subcommittee within the region that will be working on this. And it will look at all aspects of the implications of sea level rise. It will also, I'm sure, take into consideration the migration issues. And it's an interesting, I think that some countries talk about migration, others don't. Some countries that talked about it a lot in the past now have a very different narrative for themselves. And I refer to Kiribati. Kiribati, who under their previous administration bought large tracts of land in Fiji, so that if there was to be resettlement, there would be places for them to go and live. But with the government that is under President Manoa, the narrative there has totally changed. It's about, we are stewards of these atolls, of the ocean here, and we are here to stay, and we will do everything to make sure that we secure our islands so that we can stay. And that from primary school into high school, into government, you hear that narrative and a very deep commitment to that. So one could argue, oh, well, is that naive because sea is going to rise? Well, I think that we're in a very dangerous period of our time in terms of sea level rise. If temperatures for the Earth keep going up, then our atolls, we will lose our atolls, but we won't be the only place in the world that will be losing places to live. It'll happen to everybody. But thank you for your question.
Dame Meg, thank you so much. We have, it looks like 3 questions in, and oh, even more. So let me give you a couple, and we'll go from there. So this is a question from Richard Pruitt of the Stevenson Group. He says, you've discussed the threat of the Pacific Island Forum fragmentation. One of the issues related to this revolves around the issue of who is to succeed Dame Meg, who is to be the next Secretary General. The Micronesian nations believe it's their turn. They have even hinted at leaving the forum if what they regard as a gentleman's agreement is not honored. On the other hand, other nations have nominated some strong candidates. When might we expect the succession issue to be decided? And then the second question is from Satu Lemay of the East-West Center. Satu asks, his question relates to education in the Pacific Islands. And Satu is asking, you mentioned Hawaii as a destination. Is this because of the specialized fields offered there or other considerations? What are some of the top fields of educational need for Pacific Island countries? Realizing, of course, that there may be different needs in different places. But is the education needed technical, professional, general? What sort of education? And Dame Meg, let me pause there. And
the selection of the next Secretary General, it'll be hopefully the 3rd week of December. And the choice of the Secretary General will be on merit. So we will see what will happen. That'll be the decision of the leaders and the leaders alone. Thank you. On education, I mentioned Hawaii because there's been a relationship with the University of Hawaii and East-West Center over the years. That's virtually dissipated now. We don't see a lot of students from the Pacific going there. It's also closer to the region, but I'm not saying that that's the full stop. It's to get people right across onto the mainland of the United States if there was an opportunity for scholarships. The demands for the different professions, I would say it ranges from the technical well to the academic. And there's a big investment, particularly by Australia in the region, in terms of making sure that there is strong technical education with skills so that people can be mobile with the skills, but people also want to have to be technically trained so that they serve their own within their own countries and not necessarily to move abroad. When it comes to the academic side, it's the wide range, just like in any other part of the world, from engineers to your doctors, to your financiers, to your agricultural economists, and particularly to your fisheries experts. And I think each country decides what's the quotas that they want to do and put forward, and they'd be the ones that would set that. We have a regional university here, the University of South Pacific, and it offers a wide range of courses. You have the legal school that's based in Vanuatu, but there are also we want also opportunities for students to be able to do further studies internationally, and a lot of students go, as I said, China takes a huge number of our students. We also send students to the United Kingdom, and we'd like to see a large number of students being educated in the United States. And if they are coming from within governments to go and study, that they should be bound to come back and to serve the term away back in their own country so that we're not getting a brain drain. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. A couple of other questions. One picks up this theme, Dame Meg, on migration that several have already touched upon. And this is from Henry Westerman, who's an undergraduate at Georgetown University and enrolled in the Certificate for Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies. So he's one of my students. I get a little thrill there. But Henry is asking about, in addition to this question of migration, is also wondering about what nations, Pacific Island nations, can do with regard to mitigating the consequences of sea level rise. And so he wants to know broadly, what about what efforts are being made towards mitigation on sea level rise? And then another question comes in, Dame Meg, wanting to know what diasporic Pacific leaders, students, and professionals can do to contribute to the next step in Pacific regionalism. So we'll pause for your answers.
Let me just come back to migration. It's really interesting that there's a lot more discussion externally, and I've had people from other universities in the United States on that at one point asking what work's being done on this, on migration, but regarding mitigation, etc. In the Pacific, we've actually moved beyond mitigation because we're feeling the impact of climate change. And whilst a lot of financing or financing in the world goes to mitigation purposes, much smaller amount goes to mitigation and adaptation. My apologies, into adaptation. So what we've had to do here in the region is think about what do we do to protect ourselves. So around the islands in Fiji, you will see mangroves being planted everywhere where there aren't mangroves. Looking at also moving people who are right on the water into higher ground already here in Fiji, and in other parts of the Pacific, we've had to do that. We need a lot of emphasis on what we see. Adaptation is about being resilient to prepare ourselves for what we know is going to come, because the rest of the world is still living, many people are still living the lives that they've always lived, and not really making those differences in terms of what's going to impact us in terms of the climate change temperatures. So what we're seeing here is acidification in the ocean. We know from our scientists as the Pacific community that our tuna stocks are going to start moving from west to east because of the warming of the ocean. So what's that going to mean in terms of food security for us in the region? Huh? We try to make these issues known to the world, but I don't think a lot of people really pay attention. Within the forum where I work, at the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, we've now we are hoping to have a pledging event around the Pacific Resilience Fund facility, which will be a facility that we'd like to raise about 1.5 billion to start with and then move it up. Huh? But this is really to get money into communities so that they are building their own adaptation projects or their resilience. What is it does a community need? Because we know that Cyclone 4 and Cyclone 5 will come. What is it that the community needs? They need security, they need safety, they need health centres there and buildings where people can go into and know that they are safe and not, and when they build their homes now, is building much more secure homes in the outer islands, etc. So mitigation is not a big part of the conversation here. It is really around adaptation. But if you look at the funding that is available for adaptation around the world, it's far less than it is for mitigation. Thank you.
And Dame Meg, the other question we had was on your advice for young diasporic leaders, students and professionals who want to contribute to the next step of Pacific regionalism. And if you don't mind, we have one other question that's come in, so let me offer this to you as well. And this is from Jacob Levin. And Jacob is curious about the ongoing dialogue between Bougainville and the government in Papua New Guinea in Port Moresby, and over the question of separation and independence. And Jacob wonders, for you, whether this is specifically an interest of yours from the forum's perspective, but also what interest and what perspective do you have as a Papua New Guinean? How does this affect you? Do you spend time thinking about it? So I'll leave you with those two questions, please. Thank you.
Diaspora, and I apologise for not answering this. For young people, if we can help you to get the information that you need so you can be advocates for us around the world, that is the most that you can do in every community that you are in, that you can participate in the future of this Pacific by telling people of the issues that are important to us. The particular issues that are important to us are the issues around climate, the issues around health. And one of the health issues that is so important for us is that non-communicable diseases, that we have a lot of diabetes in this region and we lose a lot of our population to that. But it's making sure that people know that we won't survive on these islands if we have poor health. We will not survive if people keep living the lifestyles that they want. We need the commitment of the Paris Agreement. We need the resources that were committed so that the Pacific can prepare itself for the future, so that we can have a life for the next 100 years or more here. We can also provide information on where we are in terms of our maritime boundaries work so that you can educate people around what is happening in the marine sector here and maritime boundaries, but also on our fishing sector. So you can always contact me here, Meg T at forumsec.org. And from there, I'll be able to supply you through our communications people so that you can be advocates for us. Thank you. Thank you, Jacob, for the comments on Bougainville. The referendum has happened and the people of Bougainville have decided what they want. The current discussions between the government of Papua and Bougainville, I apologise, I am not privy to those conversations. I think it's very much between the cabinet and the cabinets of the two governments, and we'll see what the future holds in that. As a Papua New Guinean, you know, there was a sadness in my heart when I saw the result of the vote, but I understood it and I respected it. I grew up at a time when we were forging independence, self-government and independence, and I was at that time working as private secretary to the chief minister, and then we gained independence. And John Momus and people were very involved, of course, in the constitution and the debates around provincial governments. So we always knew that Bougainville had aspirations for itself. But I think when you've shared dreams with Bougainvillians, my friends at that time, through the political parties that we belong, political party that we belong to and the aspirations, it was always about all of us. But history has taken us down a road because of things that have happened but also because of the loss of life and the fact that people want to determine their own future. And in that sense, whilst there is a sadness in my heart, I respect the people and for what they want. And I hope that the journey forward between Papua New Guinea and Bougainville will be a very strong one.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. It looks like we have one last question, if we could, and it's a crisp question. And Peter Rosenblatt asks, what do the Forum member states need the most from the United States?
This is probably going to sound really a little bit odder, but I've been to two Pacific Island Forum meetings where the representatives of the United States just didn't understand where they were and kept referring to us as the theatre, the Pacific theatre. And when leaders said to me, what do they mean by the word theatre? It was about, you know, it's the military theatre where the war was fought. Well, you know, we've all moved on from there. And look, this is not out of a respect for those soldiers from the United States who fought in our waters and on our lands and lost their lives for what freedom that we have now. However, in this century, what I would like to see from the United States is a respect for the Pacific countries and to let the voice of the Pacific be heard. And when they come to this region is to really ask of us what we want and not be told what is needed in this region. And so I'll leave it at that before I get into a whole deliberation around the relationships we have with all the different powers. But thank you for your question. Thank you.
Dame Meg, thank you so much for your presentation today. I think we've all very much learned a great deal and enjoyed hearing what you have to say about the Blue Pacific future. And you paint a picture that is full of challenge, but you also paint a picture that has hope. And it has hope as you underscore the importance of leadership. And I'm quite sure that the Pacific Islands will continue to generate leaders who are able to point out the needs and the interests of the Pacific Island peoples for others in the broader community. And I want to wish you all the best and thank you so much for your time. And I will say good night and or good morning or wherever you are in the world. And I wish everyone all the best. Thank you.